The desert does not merely exist, it breathes, it waits, and it remembers. Most people who visit the high deserts of Utah see only the majestic arches and the vibrant red rock formations that adorn the postcards. They see a playground for hiking and a canvas for sunset photography. But those who live near the jagged edges of the wilderness know that the desert is a deceptive entity. It is a place where the sun bleaches the truth out of the soil and where the shadows have a weight that can crush a man's spirit. I'm writing this because the silence of my apartment in Salt Lake City has become unbearable. Every time the floorboards creak or the wind brushes against the window pane, I find myself looking for something that shouldn't be there. I am haunted by a trip that was supposed to be a simple escape, a journey into the void that ended with the void following us back. It began on a Thursday in late September. The air was beginning to carry the sharp, cold promise of winter, but the desert was still radiating the stored heat of a long, brutal summer. My two closest friends, Ryan and Miguel, had been planning this excursion for months. We were overlanders, a term that basically meant we liked to drive expensive four-wheel drive vehicles into places where we had no business being, carrying enough gear to survive a small apocalypse. Ryan was the leader. He was a mechanical engineer by trade, a man who found comfort in torque specifications, GPS coordinates, and topographical maps. He drove a heavily modified Toyota Tacoma, a machine he had nicknamed the Mule. It was outfitted with a reinforced steel bumper, a winch capable of pulling a house, and a rooftop tent that unfolded like an origami masterpiece. Ryan didn't just like the outdoors, he wanted to conquer them. To him, the desert was a series of technical challenges to be solved. Miguel was different. He was a graphic artist, a soul who saw the world in gradients and textures. He had recently gone through a devastating divorce, a quiet collapse of a 10-year relationship that had left him wandering through his days like a ghost. He joined the trip because he needed to feel something other than the hollow ache in his chest. He wanted to be small. He wanted the vastness of the San Rafael swell to make his problems feel insignificant. And then there was me, Matt. I was the observer. I brought the camera and the journals. I was the one who kept track of the stories, never realizing that I was about to become the protagonist of a nightmare. We departed Salt Lake City at dawn, the city lights fading in our rearview mirrors as we headed south on I-15. The transition from the urban sprawl to the raw, uncarved earth of southern Utah is always jarring. One moment you are surrounded by glass and steel, and the next you are entering a kingdom of stone. Our final stop for supplies was a small, dusty town called Green River. It is a place that feels like it's being slowly swallowed by the sand. The gas station we stopped at was a relic of a different era, with rusted pumps and a convenience store that smelled of stale coffee and old leather. While Ryan was busy checking the tire pressure for the 10th time, I went inside to grab a few extra gallons of water. An old man was sitting behind the counter, his skin so weathered it looked like the bark of a juniper tree. He watched me with eyes that were clouded by cataracts but still seemed to see right through me. He noticed the maps in my hand. "You boys going out towards the canyons?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Yeah," I replied, heading deep into the swell, looking for some solitude. The old man leaned forward, his chair groaning under the movement. "Solitude is one thing, the empty is another. There are parts of that desert that don't belong to the Bureau of Land Management. They don't belong to the state. They don't even belong to this time." I gave him a polite, skeptical smile. "We've got GPS, satellite phones, and enough water for a week. We'll be fine." The old man didn't smile back. "The desert doesn't care about your gadgets. It doesn't care about your plans. Just remember one thing. If you find a road that isn't on your map, don't take it. And if you see something that doesn't fit the landscape, don't look at it too long. The more you notice the desert, the more it starts to notice you." I laughed it off as the ramblings of a local landlord trying to spook a city boy. I walked back out to the truck where Ryan was revving the engine, eager to leave the pavement behind. We turned onto a dirt road that stretched towards the horizon, leaving a massive plume of red dust in our wake. We were heading into the heart of the void, unaware that the old man's warning was the most valuable thing we carried. The dirt road eventually gave way to a series of rocky washes and sandy tracks. The Tacoma handled it with ease, the suspension soaking up the irregularities of the terrain. For hours, we drove deeper into a labyrinth of mesas and buttes. The scale of the landscape was impossible to capture. Every turn revealed a new vista of ancient stone, carved by millions of years of wind and water into shapes that defied logic. By mid-afternoon, we had reached our target coordinates. It was a secluded plateau overlooking a deep, winding canyon. There was no evidence of human life, no tire tracks, no fire rings, no discarded trash. It was exactly what Ryan had promised, a total disconnection from the world. We set up camp as the sun began its slow descent. The light turned the cliffs into pillars of fire, the oranges and reds becoming so intense they looked artificial. We worked in a comfortable rhythm. The familiar tasks of camp life provided a sense of security. Ryan deployed the rooftop tent, Miguel started a small fire using gathered sagebrush, and I set up the cooking station. As the sun dipped below the rim of the canyon, the temperature plummeted. In the desert, the heat doesn't linger. It vanishes the moment the light leaves. We huddled around the fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound in a world of absolute stillness. "You feel that?" Miguel asked, staring into the flames. "Feel what? The cold?" teased Ryan, taking a swig of beer. "No," Miguel said, his voice low. "The weight of it. It's so quiet out here that I can hear my own heartbeat. It feels like the air is heavy, like we're at the bottom of an ocean." Ryan rolled his eyes. "That's just the lack of white noise, Mig. No cars, no planes, no hum of electricity. It takes a while for your brain to adjust to the silence." But I knew what Miguel meant. The silence wasn't empty. It felt occupied. It felt as though the darkness surrounding our small circle of firelight was pressing inward, testing our resolve. The next morning, the unease of the night had vanished, replaced by the stark, bright reality of a desert morning. After a breakfast of coffee and dehydrated eggs, we decided to explore a nearby side canyon on foot. The canyon was narrow, the walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, narrowing until a sliver of blue sky was visible above. The ground was soft sand, making every step a labor. About 2 miles in, the canyon opened up into a small circular alcove. In the center of the alcove stood a lone juniper tree, its branches twisted into impossible knots. Hanging from the branches were dozens of small bundles. They were made from weathered leather and tied with what looked like coarse, dark hair. "What is this?" I asked, stepping closer. "Probably some kind of local art project," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. He reached out and touched one of the bundles. It swung gently, and the sound it made was like dry parchment rubbing together. "These look like medicine bundles or offerings. We shouldn't be here, Ryan. This feels private." Against his better judgment, Ryan used his pocket knife to carefully snip the hair tie on one of the smaller bundles. It fell into his hand and spilled open. Inside were several bleached white bones, small like those of a bird or a rodent, and a single tarnished silver ring. The air in the alcove suddenly felt several degrees colder. "Put it back," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's just a ring, Matt," Ryan said, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He dropped the bones and the ring back into the leather scrap and tried to retie the hair, but it was brittle and snapped in his fingers. He eventually just stuffed the bundle into a crevice in the juniper tree. As we walked back to camp, the sun seemed dimmer than it should have been. The shadows of the canyon walls seemed to stretch towards us, reaching out like long, dark fingers. We didn't talk for the rest of the hike. The sense of being intruders in a sacred or cursed place was impossible to ignore. When we returned to the truck, something was different. The Tacoma was exactly as we had left it, but the heavy dust that had coated the hood was disturbed. It looked like someone had drawn a long single line through the dust with a finger, encircling the entire vehicle in a perfect, unbroken loop. The circle in the dust was not a random mark. It was a deliberate, continuous stroke that began at the front grille of the Tacoma and moved with mathematical precision around the entire perimeter of the vehicle. Ryan stared at it, his hand hovering over the door handle. He was a man of logic, a man who believed that every effect had a measurable cause. But as he looked at the perfect line, his brow furrowed in a way I had never seen before. "Maybe a coyote?" Miguel suggested, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his lack of conviction. "Coyotes don't walk in perfect circles around trucks, Miguel," Ryan snapped. He knelt down, inspecting the ground. "And there are no footprints. Look at the sand. It's undisturbed. There's the line, but there isn't a single track leading to it or away from it." He was right. The red silt of the desert floor was like a fresh coat of snow. It recorded everything. A lizard's tail, a beetle's path, the wind's ripples, all were visible. But there were no human footprints, no animal tracks, nothing to explain how someone or something could have walked around the truck to draw that line. "The wind could have done it," I said, trying to play the role of the rationalist. "A tumbleweed caught under the chassis, spinning in the breeze? In a perfect circle, without leaving a single scratch on the paint?" Ryan shook his head. He reached out and smeared a section of the line with his thumb, as if breaking the circle would break the spell. "We're leaving now." "We were supposed to stay 2 more nights," Miguel said. "Plans change," Ryan replied firmly. "Pack the gear. I don't like the energy here. That old man at the gas station, maybe he wasn't just talking to hear himself." We moved with a frantic energy. The slow, methodical process of breaking camp was replaced by a desperate scramble. We tossed the cooking gear into the storage bins without cleaning them. We collapsed the rooftop tent with more force than necessary. The desert, which had seemed so beautiful only hours before, now felt predatory. The silence was no longer peaceful. It felt like a predator holding its breath. As I climbed into the passenger seat, I looked back at the juniper tree in the distance. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a figure standing beneath its twisted branches, something tall, pale, and impossibly thin. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just the trick of the heat haze, I told myself. Just the mind trying to find shapes in the chaos. Ryan put the Tacoma into gear and accelerated. The engine roared, a comforting, mechanical sound that should have made us feel safe. We followed our own tracks back out toward the main BLM road. Ryan kept his eyes fixed on the GPS screen mounted to the dashboard. 20 miles to the junction, Ryan announced. "We'll be back on asphalt in 45 minutes. But the desert had changed. The landmarks we had noted on the way in, the split mesa, the rusted-out sedan, the dry wash shaped like a lightning bolt, were no longer where they were supposed to be. The road seemed to stretch and warp. The odometer showed we had traveled 15 miles, then 20, then 25. "We should have hit the junction by now," I pointed out, my eyes scanning the horizon. Ryan slowed the truck. He looked at the GPS, then at the paper map on his lap. "The coordinates say we're on the right track. The satellite fix is strong, but the terrain, it doesn't match." He was right. According to the map, we should be in a wide, flat basin. Instead, we were driving through a narrow canyon with walls that seemed to be closing in. The stone was a dark, bruised purple, and the sky above was a sickly, pale yellow. "Turn around," Miguel whispered from the back seat. "Ryan, turn the truck around. Let's just go back to where we started and try the other fork." Ryan didn't argue. He performed a multi-point turn in the narrow space, the tires churning up clouds of red dust. We headed back the way we came, following the very tire tracks we had just laid down. We drove for 10 minutes in total silence, our eyes glued to the path ahead. Then, Ryan slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt. In front of us, in the middle of the road, was our own campsite. There was the blackened fire ring. There was the patch of flattened sagebrush where we had parked, and there, standing in the middle of the road, was the lone juniper tree with the leather bundles hanging from its branches. "That's impossible," I breathed. "We drove away from here. We drove in a straight line for 30 minutes. "Maybe it's a different tree," Ryan said, his voice cracking. "Maybe it's just a similar-looking spot." He got out of the truck and walked toward the fire ring. He reached down and picked up an object from the dirt. He held it up for us to see. It was a crushed beer can, the specific brand Miguel had been drinking the night before. "We haven't just returned to our campsite.
We had looped back to the exact same point in space, despite driving in the opposite direction. The realization of being trapped in a spatial loop is a slow-acting poison. It doesn't hit you at all at once. It seeps into your bones, replacing hope with a cold, hollow dread. We sat in the truck for a long time, the engine idling, the air conditioner humming a dissonant tune. "We follow the tracks again," Ryan said, his jaw set in a grim line. "But this time, we don't look at the GPS, we don't look at the map, we just follow the physical tracks in the sand. They have to lead somewhere." We tried again, and again, and again. Each time we drove until the odometer registered 10 miles. Each time the landscape would shift subtly, the colors of the rocks deepening, the shadows lengthening even though it was only noon. And each time we would round a bend only to find ourselves staring at the same juniper tree, the same fire ring, and the same leather bundles. By the fourth attempt, the sun began to dip behind the mesas. The golden hour of the desert arrived, but there was no beauty in it. The light was harsh and oppressive.
"We're staying here," Ryan finally said, turning off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. "We're low on fuel. We can't keep burning gas if we're just moving in circles. We wait for morning. Maybe the light will change things." "We can't stay here," Miguel said, his voice rising in pitch. "Look at the bundles, Ryan. They're moving." I looked. The wind was dead still. Not a single leaf on the sagebrush moved, but the leather bundles on the juniper tree were swaying violently, as if caught in a localized hurricane. They knocked against each other with a dry, rhythmic thudding that sounded like a slow, steady heartbeat. "Ignore it," Ryan commanded. "It's an optical illusion. The heat is rising off the ground." But it wasn't the heat. As we watched, one of the bundles untied itself. The dark hair unspooled in slow motion, and the leather wrap fell away. Something fell from the bundle. Not bones this time, but something dark and wet. It hit the sand with a heavy thud. None of us moved to see what it was. We climbed into the truck and locked the doors. Night fell with a finality that felt like a tombstone being slid into place. We didn't light a fire. We didn't want to be a beacon. We sat in the cramped cabin of the Tacoma, the three of us huddled together, listening to the desert. The sounds began around midnight. It wasn't the laughing coyotes this time. It was the sound of a radio, a low-frequency broadcast that seemed to be coming from the very rocks themselves. It was a cacophony of voices, overlapping and distorted. I could hear snatches of weather reports from the 1950s, fragments of Navajo chants, and the sobbing of a child. Ryan reached for the truck's radio dial. Maybe I can pick up an emergency frequency. He turned the knob. The speakers crackled with static. He tuned through the bands, but every station was the same, a rhythmic, pulsing hum. Then the static cleared. "Matt?" the radio said. It was my mother's voice. It was clear and sharp, as if she were sitting in the back seat. "Matt? Honey, why didn't you come home for dinner? The meatloaf is getting cold." "Don't answer it," Miguel whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "Matt, are you there?" the voice continued. "It's so dark out here. I can't find the light switch. Can you help me find the light switch?" The voice shifted. It became deeper, more masculine. It became Ryan's voice. "Hey, Matt, I think there's something wrong with the winch. Come outside and help me check the winch." I looked at Ryan. He was sitting right next to me, his hands on the steering wheel, his face pale and frozen. He wasn't speaking. His mouth wasn't even moving. "I'm right here, Matt. I'm not saying that," the real Ryan whispered. The radio Ryan continued. "It's okay, Matt. The circle is broken. You can come out now. The desert just wants to talk. It's been so lonely out here. So many years of just sand and wind. It just wants to hear a human voice." Then, the most terrifying thing happened. The voice on the radio started to sync up with a tapping on the window. Something was outside. I couldn't bring myself to look. I stared straight ahead at the dashboard, watching the glowing green numbers of the clock. 1:14 a.m. "Matt, look at me," the voice outside the window said. It was Miguel's voice now. "I found the way out. There's a road. It's right behind the tree. Just open the door and I'll show you." I risked a glance at Miguel in the back seat. He was curled into a ball, his hands over his ears, weeping silently.
The tapping grew louder. The truck began to rock gently as if someone, or many someones, were pushing against the sides, testing the suspension. The metal groaned under the pressure. "They're trying to get in," Miguel whimpered. "They're trying to get in." "They can't," Ryan said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's a vehicle. It's a sealed environment. They're just echoes. It's the magnetic minerals in the rocks. They store sound. It's a known phenomenon." "Ryan, stop with the science," I shouted. "The truck is moving. Look at the horizon." I looked out the windshield. The mesas in the distance were shifting. They weren't just moving, they were changing shape. They were melting like wax, their jagged peaks smoothing out and then reforming into the shapes of giant monolithic faces, faces that were looking down at us with hollow eyes. The radio erupted into a deafening scream, a single prolonged note of agony that vibrated through our teeth. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a room where someone has just died. When the first light of dawn touched the desert, we were all still awake, our eyes red-shot and our nerves frayed to the breaking point. The landscape had returned to its normal state. The faces in the rocks were gone, replaced by the familiar red sandstone. "We're leaving," Ryan said. His voice was hollow. "We don't follow the road. We drive cross-country. We head due north. I've got the compass. We don't stop for anything." We checked the fuel. We had a quarter of a tank left, plus the 2 5-gallon jerry cans on the back. It would have to be enough. "Where's Miguel?" I asked. The back seat was empty. "He was just there," Ryan said, spinning around. "He was there 5 minutes ago. I heard him breathing." The rear passenger door was closed. The lock was still engaged, but Miguel was gone. There was no sign of a struggle. His sleeping bag was still there, rumpled as if he had just stepped out for a moment. His boots were still on the floorboard. "Miguel!" we screamed, stepping out of the truck. The desert offered no echo. Our voices seemed to be swallowed by the sand the moment they left our throats. We searched the immediate area around the truck. There were no footprints leading away from the vehicle, just the same red dust, undisturbed and silent. "We can't leave him," I said, my voice cracking. "He couldn't have gone far. He didn't even have his shoes." We searched for an hour, calling his name until our throats were raw. We checked the wash, the alcove with the juniper tree, and the ridges above. Nothing. It was as if Miguel had simply ceased to exist, erased from reality by the very air he breathed. "We have to go, Matt," Ryan said. He was standing by the truck, his hand trembling as he held the door open. "We can't leave him. He's not here anymore," Ryan yelled, and for the first time, I saw true, unadulterated terror in his eyes. "Look at the truck, Matt. Look at the side of the truck." I walked around to the passenger side. There, scratched into the thick dust on the door, were words. They weren't written in human hand. The letters were jagged, elongated, and seemed to vibrate if you looked at them too long. "The loop is closed. The third is taken. The second is watching. The first is gone." "What does that mean?" I whispered. "I don't know," Ryan said, scrambling into the driver's seat, "but we're not staying to find out."
The engine of the Tacoma screamed as Ryan pushed it beyond its intended limits. We had abandoned the ghost of a road entirely. Ryan's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the compass on the dash and the horizon. We were no longer looking for a path. We were trying to pierce the veil of the desert by sheer force of will. The terrain became a punishing obstacle course. We bounced over fields of jagged lava rock that threatened to shred our tires. We crested dunes of soft, fine sand that acted like quicksand, the truck's tires spinning and throwing up plumes of red dust as the traction control system struggled to find purchase. Every minute felt like an hour. Every mile felt like a marathon. "We're going north," Ryan muttered, more to himself than to me. "North takes us to the interstate. If we hit the interstate, the loop has to break. It's a man-made structure of steel and concrete. The desert can't claim the interstate." I looked out the window. The landscape was no longer shifting in the obvious melting way it had during the night, but it was still wrong. The perspective was skewed. A mesa that looked miles away would suddenly be right beside us in a matter of seconds. The shadows were falling in directions that didn't correspond with the position of the sun. The sun itself looked bloated, a pale, sickly disk hanging in a sky that was becoming a bruised shade of violet. "Ryan," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "the fuel." He glanced at the gauge. The needle was hovering dangerously close to the red E. We had been driving for 3 hours, but the odometer showed we had only covered 12 miles. The math didn't add up. We should have been across the border into the next county by now. "The jerry cans," Ryan said, his voice flat. "We stop, we pour them in, and we keep moving. We don't turn off the engine." We pulled over in a flat stretch of hard-packed clay. The silence that rushed in when the truck stopped moving was physical. It felt like a heavy blanket being dropped over us. I stayed in the passenger seat, my eyes scanning the ridges, while Ryan jumped out to grab the fuel cans from the rear rack. I watched him in the side mirror. He was moving with a frantic, jerky motion. He unscrewed the cap of the first 5-gallon can and began the pour. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming in the still air. Suddenly, Ryan stopped. He stood perfectly still, the half-full can still tilted toward the fuel neck. He was looking at the ground beneath the truck. "Matt!" he called out. His voice was hollow, stripped of all emotion. "Get out here! You need to see this!" I hesitated, the memory of the voice from the night before still ringing in my ears. But this was the real Ryan. I could see his breath in the cold air. I stepped out of the truck, my feet hitting the clay with a dull sound. I walked to the back of the truck. Ryan pointed to the ground. There, in the soft clay directly beneath our tires, were tracks. But they weren't the tracks of our truck. They were footprints. Hundreds of them. They were all identical, the size of a grown man's foot, but the toes were elongated, ending in sharp, narrow points. The tracks didn't lead toward the truck or away from it. They simply existed in the space directly underneath the chassis, as if something had been standing there, hidden by the body of the vehicle, the entire time we were driving. And then I saw the most chilling detail. Among the strange, pointed footprints, there was a single set of human tracks. They were bare feet, smaller. "Miguel," I whispered. The tracks led from the center of the truck's undercarriage and stopped abruptly, 3 feet away. There was no sign of a struggle, no drag marks, just the end of a trail. We didn't finish the second fuel can. Ryan tossed it into the bed of the truck, half empty, and scrambled back inside. We took off again, the tires screaming as they gripped the clay. We drove until the sun reached its zenith. The heat was now a physical weight, shimmering off the rocks in waves that distorted everything. And then, on the horizon, we saw a shape. "Is that a building?" I asked, squinting through the glare. "No," Ryan said, his voice trembling. "It's a vehicle." As we got closer, the shape resolved into a familiar silhouette. It was a white Toyota Tacoma. It was outfitted with a steel bumper, a winch, and a rooftop tent. It was an exact replica of Ryan's truck. It was sitting in the middle of a dry lake bed, tilted slightly to one side. Its windows were caked with dust, and its tires were flat, the rubber cracked and rotting. Ryan slowed as we approached. "Maybe it's someone who had the same build. A lot of people use these parts." "Ryan, look at the license plate," I said. The plate was bent and rusted, but the letters were still legible. It was Ryan's plate. We stopped 20 feet away from the twin truck. The silence of the lake bed was absolute. There was no wind here, no sound of birds, no rustle of sagebrush, just the two trucks, one a vibrant living machine, and the other a sun-bleached skeleton. Ryan got out, drawn to the wreck like a moth to the flame. I followed him, my heart hammering against my ribs. The interior of the stalled truck was filled with fine red sand that had drifted in through the vents. On the dashboard sat a camera, the same model as mine. In the back seat were Miguel's boots, looking exactly as they had when he vanished.
but it was the driver's seat that held the true horror. There was no body, but there was a shape. The seat cover was stained with a dark, oily substance that had seeped into the foam. Resting on the center console was a notebook. Ryan picked it up. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was unmistakably his. He flipped through the pages. The early entries were standard trip logs, fuel stops, weather, coordinates. But as the pages turned, the handwriting became more erratic, the letters stretching and warping until they were barely legible. Day 4. The loop is tighter now. We saw the truck again today. It's the 3rd time. Matt won't stop crying. He says the stars are the wrong shape. Day 7. Miguel is gone. He didn't walk away. He just folded like a piece of paper. I can hear him in the static, but he sounds like a bird now. Day 14. The 2nd is watching me. He looks like Matt, but his eyes are horizontal. He doesn't eat. He just sits in the passenger seat and waits for the sun to go down. Ryan dropped the notebook as if it were made of burning coal. We've been here before. We've been here 1,000 times.
We aren't in Utah anymore, I said, the realization finally breaking through my shock. We're in a pocket, a fold. Whatever that old man was talking about, we stepped over the line. I can fix this, Ryan said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the horizon, his eyes wide and vacant. I just need to recalibrate the GPS. I need to find the frequency. It's a matter of resonance. If the desert is vibrating at a certain frequency, we just need to match it. He began to pull equipment out of our truck, throwing it under the salt crust of the lake bed. He was talking to himself now, a stream of consciousness monologue about physics, geometry, and ancient ley lines. He looked older. In the span of a few hours, deep lines had etched themselves into his face, and his hair seemed thinner, grayer. Ryan, we need to go, I pleaded. We can't stay on this lake bed. We're sitting ducks. The 1st is gone, Ryan said, ignoring me. The 3rd is taken. That's what the door said, Matt. Miguel was the 3rd. I'm the 1st. You're the 2nd. He stopped his work and turned to look at me. His pupils were so dilated that his eyes looked entirely black. The 2nd is watching. That's you, Matt. You're the observer. You're the one who records the loop. Without the observer, the loop can't exist. If you stop watching, we can leave. I don't understand, I said, backing away. Close your eyes, Ryan shouted. Stop looking at the rocks. Stop looking at the sky. If you stop perceiving it, it loses its power. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for my face. I dodged him, the salt crust crunching under my feet. He fell to his knees, sobbing. But the sound that came out of his throat wasn't a human sob. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pulsing, like a signal being broadcast from deep underground. I looked away from him toward the horizon. The mesas were no longer mountains. They were moving. They were walking. They were massive, multi-legged entities of stone and shadow, their heads lost in the violet clouds. They were circling the lake bed, their footsteps causing the ground to heave and buckle. I realized then that Ryan was right, in a terrible, twisted way. My presence, my consciousness was the anchor. The desert was a predatory ecosystem that fed on perception. It used our memories, our voices, and our fears to build a world to trap us in. I climbed back into the Tacoma, our Tacoma, and locked the door. I didn't look at Ryan. I didn't look at the other truck. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the floor mat. I focused on something real, something from the world outside. I tried to remember the smell of rain on asphalt. I tried to remember the sound of a crowded restaurant in the city. I tried to visualize the faces of people I knew, people who were currently sitting in offices or watching television, unaware that the world had a jagged, hungry edge. The truck began to shake, not the shaking of an engine, but the shaking of a reality being torn apart. I heard Ryan's voice outside, but it was joined by Miguel's and then by the old man's from the gas station. They were all speaking at once, a wall of sound that vibrated the glass of the windows. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes on the floor mat. The temperature in the cabin began to rise. The smell of ozone and burning sage filled the air. I felt a hand on my shoulder, a cold, heavy weight, but I didn't turn around. "Don't look, Matt," the voice of my mother whispered in my ear. "Just stay in the dark. The dark is safe." I squeezed my eyes shut. I leaned my head against the steering wheel and began to count. 1, 2, 3. I counted for what felt like hours. The sounds outside shifted from screams to whispers, and then to the sound of wind. Not the artificial mocking wind of the loop, but the real, chaotic wind of the open desert. When I finally opened my eyes, the violet sky was gone. The sun was setting, but it was a normal golden red sun. The bruised clouds had vanished, replaced by the deep indigo of a desert dusk. I was sitting in the Tacoma, but the truck wasn't on a lake bed. It was parked on the side of a paved highway. I looked in the rearview mirror. The truck rode back into the distance, a straight line of asphalt cutting through the sagebrush. I looked in the passenger seat. It was empty. I looked in the back seat. Miguel's gear was gone. Ryan's gear was gone. I was alone. I got out of the truck, my legs shaking so violently I had to lean against the door for support. I looked at the side of the truck. The message in the dust was gone. The truck was clean, as if it had just been washed. I walked to the back of the truck. The jerry cans were full. The rooftop tent was neatly folded and bolted down. There was no sign that Ryan or Miguel had ever been on this trip. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It had a signal. I looked at the date. It was the same Thursday we had left Salt Lake City. The clock showed 10:30 a.m. I had been gone for less than 4 hours. I drove back to Salt Lake City in a trance. I didn't go to my apartment. I went to Ryan's house. His truck, a different Tacoma, a stock model he used for daily driving, was in the driveway. I knocked on the door. Ryan's wife, Sarah, answered. She looked at me with confusion. "Matt, I thought you were at work. Is everything okay?" "Is Ryan here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Ryan? He's in Portland, remember? He left on Monday for that engineering conference. He won't be back until Sunday." I felt the world tilt. "And Miguel?" "Miguel moved to Chicago last month, Matt. Have you been sleeping? You look terrible." I backed away from the porch, mumbling an apology. I went to my car and sat there, the engine idling. The desert hadn't just taken them, it had erased them from the timeline of that weekend. Or perhaps it had replaced the reality I knew with one where they were safe, far away from the San Rafael swell. I reached into the glove box and found my journal. I opened it to the last page. It was empty. But as I watched, words began to appear on the paper. They weren't written in ink. They were etched into the fiber of the page as if by an invisible fingernail. "The second is watching." I closed the journal and threw it out the window into the gutter. I moved to a different city a week later. I sold the truck. I stopped going out after dark. I live in a world of bright lights and loud noises. I keep the television on all the time to drown out the silence. But sometimes, when the wind blows from the south, I can smell the scent of burning sagebrush. And sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I hear a radio crackling in the corner of the room. It's Ryan's voice, or maybe it's mine. The loop is closing, Matt. We're just waiting for you to look back.
There is a specific kind of cold that does not just chill the skin, but attempts to rewrite the soul. It is the cold of the high Arctic, a place where the sun is a distant, disinterested spectator, and the wind is the only true sovereign. My name is Elias Thorne, and I am a climatologist by trade, but a seeker of silence by nature. It was this craving for the absolute void that led me to accept a 6-month solo contract at Station Borealis, a remote research outpost situated on the edge of the Svalbard archipelago. The station was a marvel of brutalist engineering, a cluster of reinforced titanium pods perched on stilts above the permafrost. It was designed to withstand hurricane-force winds and temperatures that could shatter steel. When the supply helicopter dropped me off in the waning light of October, the pilot didn't even turn off his engine. He handed me my crates of dehydrated rations and medical supplies, gave me a look that was half pity and half admiration, and disappeared into the gray veil of the coming winter. The silence that followed was immediate and total. It was not the absence of sound, but rather a presence of its own, a heavy, expectant weight that seemed to press against the glass of my observation dome. For the first few weeks, I found the isolation therapeutic. I spent my days calibrating sensors, analyzing ice core samples, and maintaining the diesel generators. The work was rhythmic, predictable, and safe. But the Arctic has a way of thinning the boundaries between the physical world and the world of the mind. By the time the polar night arrived, a period of 4 months where the sun never rises above the horizon, the station began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a laboratory for madness. Station Borealis had been empty for 6 months before my arrival. The previous occupant, a Russian researcher named Dr. Volkov, had been evacuated due to a medical emergency. The official report was vague, citing a nervous breakdown and severe malnutrition. As I moved into the living quarters, I found traces of him everywhere. He had left behind a collection of classical music records, a stack of heavily annotated books on theoretical physics, and a small hand-carved wooden bird. But it was his journals that truly concerned me. They were tucked away in a ventilation shaft, hidden as if he feared someone or something would find them. The early entries were professional, filled with data on methane emissions and permafrost degradation. But as the winter progressed, the handwriting began to deteriorate. The letters became jagged and elongated, stretching across the pages like frozen veins. "It is breathing," he wrote in an entry dated December 12th. "It waits for me to exhale so it can take my breath and use it to speak. I heard my mother's voice today. She has been dead for 20 years, but she was standing outside the airlock asking me if I had remembered to wear my scarf. I did not open the door. I am not a fool. But the voice did not come from the speakers. It came from the vibrations of the metal walls." I dismissed Volkov's writings as the product of cabin fever. It was a well-documented phenomenon in polar research. The brain, deprived of external stimuli, begins to invent its own. I was a man of science. I had a psychiatric evaluation before I took this job. I was stable. That was before the first anomaly occurred. It happened during a routine inspection of the external sensor array. The temperature was minus 50 degrees Celsius, a cold so intense that any exposed skin would freeze in seconds. I was encased in a heavy-duty thermal suit, my vision limited by the fog-resistant visor of my helmet. As I worked on the anemometer, I saw a movement in the distance. About 50 yards away, standing on a ridge of wind-swept snow, was a figure. It was dressed in the same bright orange thermal suit as mine. I stopped moving. The figure stopped moving. I raised my right arm in a wave. The figure raised its left arm. I assumed it was a mirage, a fata morgana caused by the refraction of light through ice crystals. But there was no light source to create a mirage. The only illumination came from the powerful floodlights of the station. I walked toward the ridge. The figure walked toward me. Each step I took, it mirrored perfectly. There was no sound of footsteps, no crunch of snow. It was like walking toward a giant vertical mirror in the middle of a wasteland. When I was only 10 feet away, I stopped. The figure was an exact replica of me, down to the scratches on the helmet's visor and the specific way the utility belt hung around the waist. But through the darkened glass of the entity's visor, I couldn't see a face. I saw only a swirling mass of gray mist, like a trapped blizzard. I reached out to touch the figure's hand, and as our gloves were about to meet, the figure didn't move forward.
it began to fold. It didn't fall or collapse. It simply reduced in size, its limbs bending into impossible angles until it was nothing more than a small leather-like bundle on the snow. I picked it up. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked. It was wrapped in weathered leather and tied with a cord of coarse, dark hair. My blood turned to ice. I recognized this. It was the same kind of bundle described in the Utah accounts, the story one I had read in the archives of missing persons. But I was thousands of miles away from the desert. I was in the middle of a frozen ocean. I left the bundle on the snow and ran back to the airlock. I didn't look back until I was inside the pressurized safety of the station. When I finally dared to look through the reinforced porthole, the ridge was empty. The bundle was gone.
After the encounter on the ridge, time began to lose its linear quality. I would wake up in my bunk, check the digital clock, and see that it was 8 a.m. I would go to the galley to make coffee, and when I looked at the clock again, it would be 4 p.m. 8 hours would vanish in what felt like minutes. At other times, a single second would stretch into an eternity. I would watch a drop of water fall from a leaky pipe, and it would hang in the air for what felt like hours, its surface reflecting the flickering lights of the hallway until it finally, agonizingly, hit the floor. I began to find objects in places they didn't belong. My toothbrush would be in the tool chest, a wrench would be in my bed, and most disturbingly, the wooden bird Volkov had left behind was moving. Every time I turned my back, the bird would change its position. First, it was on the desk. Then it was on the windowsill. Then it was perched on top of the security camera, its painted eyes seeming to follow me. I decided to record myself. I set up a series of GoPros throughout the station, hoping to catch the glitches in my memory. That night, I watched the footage from the previous 24 hours. For the first 12 hours, the video showed me working normally. But at 2:14 a.m., the footage changed. The me on the screen didn't go to sleep. It, stood in the center of the main pod and began to move in a rhythmic, mechanical way. He wasn't dancing, he was imitating the movement of a clock. His arms moved in perfect ticks, his head snapping from side to side with every passing second. He did this for 4 hours without stopping. And then he walked over to the camera, leaned in until his visor filled the screen, and spoke. The audio was distorted, but the words were clear. The observer is the prisoner. The prisoner is the key. The key is the ice. I turned off the monitor. My hands were shaking. I looked down at my arms, expecting to see them move in ticks, but they were still mine. Or at least they felt like mine. On the 64th day of the polar night, the station's power failed. The roar of the diesel generators, which had been the heartbeat of my existence, simply ceased. In the Arctic, power failure is a death sentence. Without the heaters, the interior temperature would drop to lethal levels within 2 hours. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the generator pod. But when I opened the connecting hatch, I wasn't met with the smell of diesel and oil. The pod was filled with a soft, pulsating blue light. It was coming from the center of the room, where the floor had been torn open. The thick titanium plates had been peeled back like the skin of an orange. Beneath the floor was not the permafrost, but a vast, bottomless shaft that glowed with an ethereal, cerulean hue. I leaned over the edge. The shaft went down forever. Far below, I could see shapes moving, massive, translucent entities that looked like jellyfish made of ice. They were singing. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. It was a vibration that resonated in my teeth and the marrow of my bones. Elias, a voice called from the depths. It was my own voice, not a recording, but my actual voice echoing back at me from the future. Elias, come down. The cold is just a transition. The ice remembers everything we have forgotten. It remembers the world before the sun.
It remembers the silence before the word. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to jump, to surrender to the blue light and the singing ice. I felt that if I stayed in the station, I would continue to fold until I was nothing more than a bundle of leather and hair. But if I jumped, I would become part of the singing. I was pulled back from the edge by a sudden violent vibration. The station groaned as the permafrost shifted. A massive crack appeared in the ceiling of the pod, and a flurry of snow began to drift in. I turned and ran. I didn't go for the emergency supplies. I didn't go for the radio. I went for the airlock. I stepped out into the night without my thermal suit. I was wearing only my base layers, thin wool and polyester. The cold hit me like a physical blow, a hammer of ice that shattered my breath. I began to walk. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from the station. The station was no longer a human structure. It had been claimed by the blue light. The wind picked up, creating a total whiteout. I couldn't see my hands in front of my face. I walked for hours, my limbs becoming heavy and numb. I knew that I was dying. I knew that the Huntington reflex would kick in, and I would start to feel a false warmth, leading me to strip off my remaining clothes before the end. But the warmth didn't come. Instead, the whiteout cleared. I was standing in the middle of a vast flat plain of ice. In front of me was a circle of stones, red sandstone stones. They were warm to the touch. I looked up. The sky was no longer the black of the Arctic night. It was the bruised violet of the Utah desert. The stars were the wrong shape, and the air smelled of burning sagebrush. I turned around. Behind me, the research station was still there, its metal pods gleaming in the starlight. But it was no longer on Svalbard. It was perched on the rim of a deep canyon in the San Rafael swell. I walked back to the station. I wasn't cold anymore. I wasn't anything. I entered the airlock. The lights were on. The generators were humming. I walked into the galley and saw a man sitting at the table, drinking coffee. He turned to look at me. It was Miguel. He looked at me with a sad, knowing smile. "You're late, Elias, or maybe you're early. It's hard to tell when the loop is this tight." "Where is Ryan?" I asked. My voice sounded like dry parchment. "Ryan is the first," Miguel said, gesturing toward the observation dome. I looked through the glass. Standing on the surface of the moon, or what looked like the moon, was the white Toyota Tacoma. Ryan was standing beside it, staring at a map that was blank. "And you, Miguel?" I asked. "You're the third?" "I'm the one who waits," Miguel said. "And you, Elias, you're the second. You're the one who watches. You're the one who keeps the story alive." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver ring. He placed it on the table. "The desert and the ice are the same thing, Elias. They are both places where the world is unfinished. They are the gaps in the fabric. We didn't get lost. We just fell through the seams." I sat down at the table. I picked up the silver ring. It was cold, colder than the Arctic wind. "What happens now?" I asked. Miguel looked out at the violet sky. "Now we wait for the next one. We wait for the one who thinks they can conquer the void with a GPS and a heavy truck. We wait for the one who thinks the silence is empty." I looked at my hands. They were starting to look like mahogany. The skin was mapping itself with deep, sun-etched lines. I felt a wooden bird land on my shoulder. It didn't make a sound. I picked up a pen and a journal, Volkov's journal. I turned to a fresh page. "Story 1 was the warning," I wrote. "Story 2 is the confirmation." I looked at the clock on the wall. The hands were moving backwards, but the numbers were changing into symbols I couldn't understand. I didn't care. I was the second. I had a job to do. I had to watch. I am still watching. If you are reading this, it means you have found the bundle. It means you have noticed the desert, and the desert has noticed you. Don't look at the stars too long. They are changing shape.